Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to speak on behalf of two downstream user applications for diarsenic trioxide. We were the consultant to these two companies, and we did large parts of the dossier and the project management. EPPA has asked me to tell you what diarsenic trioxide is. Well, there you have it. It's kind of a white crystalline powder and doesn't look much unlike sugar, in fact. You see it in the flesh. It's a carcinogen 1A, so it's a pretty nasty substance, one would say. But it's quite an old one. As you can see, there's a little bottle there from Merck Sharp and Dohme, probably from the early part of the 20th century, where it was used as a pharmaceutical use of some kind. The main applicants were Boliden and Nordhammer Zinkhütte, whom I do not represent, and I know very little about their application. But there were a few smaller uses, and I covered two of those. So, what is my company's involvement in application for authorization? Well, as Aaron alluded to, we've been quite active in substance approvals generally. In REACH, this has been in the substance prioritization phase, because if we're talking about experience in authorization industry, please realize that authorization starts before things are added to the candidate list or are actually on the authorization annex. And you might want to look at your registration file and reflect on exactly what it is that you registered and said in that, if you are concerned that your substance might at some point be the target of a prioritization. We've done dossiers for the producers. I was personally involved in the pigments dossier, which is a big producer dossier. And so for three downstream users, two have received positive recommendations so far, and the third one on trike is currently in the process, as we know. Just a disclaimer here, I'm speaking on my own behalf. I'm not speaking on behalf of Linksys or Yara specifically. Of course, I know their dossiers very intimately, but the words are my own. And anything outrageous I say, you can accuse me of. Please do not impute it to Linksys or Yara. They are innocent of anything I say, except as relates to the dossier. Now, the dossiers had obviously two things in common. One was that the substance was the same, and two, they were both very, very late. Linksys, a company you may not have heard of, but there's probably not a single person in this room that doesn't have a product of Linksys in their bag or in their wallet somewhere, because they make the little gold or silver looking square rectangle on your credit card or on your health card or what have you. And these are produced at great speed on X-flexible microcircuitry, going through a plating bath at about 8 meters per second, and they produce about 2 billion of them a year. It's a unique company with an extremely efficient manufacturing process, with two plants, one in Mantes-la-Jolie in France and the other one in Singapore, with which they deliver practically the whole global market. What's the use of diarsenic trioxide? I'm not going to go into the details of the semiconductor manufacturing process. If somebody's interested, they can talk to me about it later. It's a so-called grain refiner. Basically, what it allows Linksys to do is to plate exactly 20 nanometers of gold onto that little rectangle, and not a nanometer more or less. And that every single one of those atoms of gold is stacked precisely on top of one another, and not in little mountains or little complicated other shapes, which you don't want, because it will cause problems in the contact that little semiconductor is for. Linksys called us 9 days before the submission deadline. Please do not do this. The reason was that they had a catastrophic failure in their substitution process. It's not that they were unprepared, far from it. They had seen this coming. They had started the substitution process several years before, in coordination with their supplier, who shall remain nameless. And two things happened. One, the main component of the potential substitute they'd been testing and working on and improving for introduction in their process was reclassified, not quite to 1A, but to 1B. And at the same time, an undeclared additional substance from the supplier, through a misunderstanding with the supplier, turned out to have explosive qualities in Linksys' specific process. It was due to the fact that the process has a bit more agitation than expected, and Linksys had told them it was at room temperature, whereas it's actually at 60 degrees Celsius, which is arguably same as room temperature, but the substance became unstable at 40 degrees Celsius. And so 2.5, almost 3 years worth of research was flushed down the toilet at that moment. They scrambled in the few months before to try and find some alternative and realized this is hopeless, we need authorization. Their use, circa 20 kilograms of diarsenic trioxide a year, or about 30, 40 kilograms of total product, because it's not pure diarsenic that they use. Why was it possible to make a dossier in 9 days? Well, first of all, they'd done all this research already on alternatives, and so we had a lot of stuff already to hand. Secondly, they had measurement data coming out of their ears in terms of the exposure of their workers to diarsenic trioxide. It doesn't go out into the environment, it doesn't wind up in the final product, makes it all a lot simpler. Finally, and this is going to sound perhaps a bit shocking to some, when I got the call, I looked up, of course, the cancer caused by arsenic, and it's lung cancer, and I thought, thank God, because there at least all the health cost data is available, courtesy of the tobacco industry. And so it was very simple to make this. If it had been a reprotoxic substance with no threshold, I would have been in a really, really difficult position, and still today we are currently working on that, how to model the cost for a reprotox substance. That would have not been possible in the 9 days. Obviously, I had a lot of this information already. Yara is, as you probably know, a fertilizer producing company. They use, at one of their sites in Europe, in Le Havre, diarsenic trioxide to activate the absorption and desorption of carbon dioxide in the production of ammonia, and the ammonia is then transformed into urea, and from urea, etc., you get fertilizers. They were not a few days before the deadline, they called us 6 months after the deadline. Why had that happened? Long story, the short story is the site in question had been undergoing major restructuring, both from an ownership perspective and a management perspective. They had a lot of stuff on their plate, and this was just missed. Sounds incredible, but ladies and gentlemen, my experience in the ROS directive is that sometimes 6 years after a substance is banned, somebody figures out, hold on a second, I'm using that and I'm not supposed to. So it's, you know, they were still rather early. They were in the process of changing. They need about 5 tons per year until 2017. So it was, I think Thierry called it a bridging application, if that's a technical term. Right. Now, as a downstream user, because I've also done the producer dossiers, it's literally 10 times easier to make a producer dossier. One, because there's limited quantity, so by definition the risk is not going to be that high. If the company is respecting general legislation on carcinogens at least, they will have measured data available. And with measured data you can show what the risk exposure or emissions, whatever it is that they are. Your CSR doesn't need to be so complicated if you just can accept the risk derivation of the RAC. And I would think as a downstream user, you're very rarely in the position that you would need to disagree with RAC on that. And say, I can't even imagine why you would. And so your CSR is not that difficult to make. The socioeconomic costs as well, you are allowed under the EPPA rules to equate them more or less to your costs and the cost for the local economy to get a balance, as opposed to the situation for a producer, particularly if he produces outside of Europe, he has to show an effect on the European economy, and that's much more difficult and much more work. Obviously, knowing what it's going to cost you and perhaps the local economy in terms of employment is not so difficult. The analysis of alternatives as well is easier to make, because who knows better why it is that you're using a particular substance than you do. And if it's the CMR, certainly you examined it before already for substitution, because there is pressure predating REACH to substitute CMRs. I know there's people who are skeptical about that, but I haven't come across a single client who's not considered substituting their CMR if they could, and if they haven't, it's because they couldn't. I would say for a downstream user dossier, if you want to be able to do it, 3 months would be a reasonable time to do it. A bit more makes it a lot easier. In this case, like I said, we did it in 7 and respectively 30 days, but that was pretty much working from, on the 7 days one, from 8 o'clock in the morning till 11 o'clock in the evening for 7 days straight with 5 people on our side and 5 people on the side of Linksys. So if that's what you want to do with your life, go ahead. But personally, I wouldn't recommend it. Also because the risk of making mistakes is a little bit higher than if you have some more time to have a sleep on it and look at your dossier before pressing that send button. There were a few challenges we came across. And there's a funny story related to the medical secrecy. Some of the measured data that we had, not in the Linksys file, but in the Yara file, was subject to medical secrecy. It was a rather small group of workers. And so under privacy laws, the management was not allowed to know which group of workers was doing what and who were exposed. It was just the doctor who is independent, of course, in the company, who was allowed to see that data and who acted on that as he saw fit. And there was a bit of a surprise in that one. The economic data is sometimes a bit patchy because companies did not keep records always of costs and investments with a purpose to make authorization. So it takes a little while to dig it out from the company's accounts department. And in the case of Yara, they were proposing to substitute with DMEA, which required a major refurbishing of the plant to the tune of 20-30 million euros. And we actually found out during the authorization process that it was much simpler and cheaper and actually safer to substitute with potassium vanadate. And that is the direct consequences of the application for authorization. Like Bill said, you know, the consultant is there to challenge you, and I just challenged him. I said, explain to me why you're not using that. And there was a small silence, and 10 days later they came back and said, well, actually, you're right, we're going to use the other one. So that was, I think, an improvement because we reduced the number of years we needed authorization for by a good 5 years. So in the process, what works well, and Mr. Dunn said I should say your teams, at least on the authorization at the workers, they work well, they make your life easier in terms of the process, not harder. I know it's a bureaucratic process, so there's always hindrances here and there, but the ECHA team, you know, they demand of you what they demand, and they must, and they are strict sometimes, but they don't make your life more difficult than it should be. And I appreciate that, and I think it's worth mentioning that. I think the trialogues, I cannot underline how important they are. Linksys didn't have one because the dossier seemed fairly clear-cut. And then late in the day, we got an additional question, which we could have answered much simpler had we had our trialogue after all. And it created a lot of angst and stress, and no, everything was answered and it was all resolved. But on hindsight, I think it was a mistake that we didn't have one. With Yara, we did have one. And now the situation with Yara was that the company was in transformation. They had issues. In fact, some of their workers had been exposed over French legal limits. And I think the trialogue where the management of Yara turned up and also made a personal commitment to resolve some of the issues that they were facing was very important to build the confidence that this company was serious about meeting its obligations. And certainly we had challenges to meet. There were things that could be improved, that should have been improved, that will be improved. And the trialogue was, you know, a moment where they said, well, okay, you know, it's not perfect, but we believe that they will do it. I think the simplifications that have been adopted for downstream users are very helpful, like I mentioned on the CSR and the SEA, and certainly the dossier drafting is not as difficult or expensive as some people claim for the downstream user. It's definitely doable, and for reasons like Bill also said, that you want to safeguard your own supply line, you may well want to do it if you don't want to be the prisoner of a single supplier, even if you trust that supplier. Some other positive outtakes for industry. You know, I think Linksys is the proof that you don't need to give up if your substitution plan unexpectedly fails. I mean, such things happen, and we managed to get it through the process And in fact, the substitution work that you do, even if it failed, without that, we would not have been able to draft the dossier as quickly as we did. So that work is helpful. Don't, watch what you're doing on your substitution work, because it will be useful in your dossier. With the ARA, the alternatives were driven by the authorization dossier. We chose potassium vanadate. And there were better risk management measures for the workers coming out of it, because when we were able to lift the medical secrecy, we had to get 136 signatures for that. In fact, our toxicologist found that it was not the procedure that we expected to expose the workers that caused the exposure. It was a different one. And without the authorization dossier, we would not have found this out. So I think also the socioeconomic cases are quite clear-cut. The costs, the health costs, environmental costs, were 100,000 times lower than the cost for the company, if not more. So those cases are fairly clear-cut. It's not that difficult. Difficulties. Measured data. The measurements that are done for a particular reason, and sometimes not in the format that the RAC desires. And that has caused us some, yes, I know, Tim is waving at me there, but it's just the way it is. And I did feel that in the Linksys case, the last question we got foisted on about the dermal exposure when the process, it was not measured because there was really, practically speaking, no risk for a dermal exposure, just a theoretical one. And so we had to model, and the model then shows that the exposure is 10 times higher than the actual measurements would show. And we're asked to explain this difference. And I said, well, the difference is that your model exaggerates the risk. I think that was a little bit of an unpleasant moment. In the calculations of the socioeconomic analysis, sometimes we got down to fractions of a euro calculations, which would require half a day of my economist to recalculate. I felt this was a bit of a waste of time. The registrants did not show themselves from their nicest side. They had quite disproportionate demands for access to the registration dossier, so I had to re-input all the FISCAM data by hand. I wasn't going to pay 32,500 euros for the pleasure of having that done. And the investment is high for a single substance. $250,000 is roughly what each of these two companies spent. And both Linksys and Yara are looking at a second substance they may need to apply for authorization for in the coming years. So yes, the costs are getting lower, and I don't dispute the 30%, but unfortunately, because there are process chemicals, you might get more of them. Which leads me to my particular plea. This is a personal plea. Aaron might agree or disagree. I would say processing aids deserve, perhaps, if we're looking at simplification, Mr. Berendt, a different approach. They're not unlike intermediates. They're used in industrial settings, so generally there's more control. They don't go out in product into the market or into professional or consumer uses. They're used in many high-tech processes and are already strongly regulated. They are essential to Europe's competitive edge in manufacturing. They're also a decider for investments. I think Siemens and the German Confederation of Industry made a very cogent case where they said if we have to make an investment decision for a new plant worth $1 billion or $2 billion, and my management asked me, can you guarantee me that I'll be able to use this process chemical for the 30 years it takes me to amortize this plant? I will honestly have to answer no. And unless we do something about that, I think the tough look at the producer dossiers and the ones that go out into professional and consumer uses, I totally agree with. But on processing aids, maybe something could be done. So I propose here some changes. I can discuss them with you later. I see that I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop right here.